At 12:41 after midnight, a seismic calibration pulse returned from a depth of 12.4 kilometers. The deepest instrument at Red Basin was 2.1 kilometers below ground. The return carried casing echoes, fluid resonance, and cable noise from a shaft that had never been drilled. When engineers Red Basin was built to calibrate regional earthquake sensors. 11 instrumented boreholes descend between 600 meters and 2.1 kilometers. Their geometry is surveyed to the centimeter. The investigation into the deep return began at a high desert seismic calibration compound with borehole heads, cable drums, concrete instrument vaults, and distant red cliffs. Borehole 4 received an additional reflection 4.8 seconds after the expected basement return. Its delay corresponded to a reflector 12.4 kilometers below the site. The opening exhibit for the deep return pairs the last normal maintenance entry with a pre-incident photograph of the site. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous site record value, separating absence from disagreement. Elias Grant, the senior borehole technician, preserved the first local record before any reset or maintenance action. Borehole 4 received an additional reflection 4.8 seconds after the expected basement return. Its delay corresponded to a reflector 12.4 kilometers below the site. In the file for the deep return, the account was checked against access control, clock records, and original instrument output. The calibration pulse statement was recorded before shift change and reconciled with badge entries, calls, and handwritten notes. Exhibit 2 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, before it entered the final record. A surface hammer or buried calibration source produces a known wave. Geophones record arrival times, allowing engineers to verify depth, rock velocity, and clock alignment. At Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, the calibration pulse reading passed the safeguards intended to reject false data instead of entering through an undocumented feature. This distinction is central to the deep return. The system did not merely display a value, it admitted that value as evidence. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The first calibration pulse operational log fixed the event at 0:41.1. Borehole 4 received an additional reflection 4.8 seconds after the expected basement return. Its delay corresponded to a reflector 12.4 kilometers below the site. At Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, no warning was generated because the system classified the reading as internally valid. The raw calibration pulse log was exported before restart, preserving counters and values the interface normally rounds away. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under initial log without using the operational interface. Investigators opened the deep return with a conventional explanation. Analysts first suspected a multiple reflection between geological layers. Synthetic models could reproduce the delay, but not the narrow metallic ringing embedded in the signal. The first theory in the calibration pulse file remained provisional until evidence could reproduce it or remove it. For the deep return, investigators wrote the expected result in advance so interpretation could not be adjusted after the test. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous working hypothesis value, separating absence from disagreement. The calibration pulse event was not confined to one instrument. 3 broadband stations outside Red Basin detected the same return. Their amplitudes were too small for an earthquake and too coherent for natural scattering. In the deep return, agreement between separate references removed the easiest fault theory without locating a physical source. The independent calibration pulse instruments use different power, clocks, sensors, and processing paths. Exhibit 6 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, before it entered the final record. The investigation into the deep return changed when the reading produced a material consequence. The cable tension monitor on borehole 4 rose as if another 10 kilometers of armored cable had been suspended below the existing sonde. The drum itself did not move. Staff documented the calibration pulse effect independently of the primary software. The deep return file added photographs, mechanical indicators, and passive records because software agreement alone was insufficient. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. For the deep return, archive staff searched maintenance files, procurement ledgers, and retired procedures. A construction ledger contained one erased line. Reference return, depth not surveyed. The paper carried a black PS4 calibration label beneath the correction fluid. The calibration pulse reference predated the active equipment and was absent from routine training. The archived calibration pulse copy carried custody marks from before the current staff, vendor, and control system existed. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under archive retrieval without using the operational interface. The calibration pulse anomaly returned under a repeatable condition. The deep return appeared only after a formal calibration sequence and repeated the sequence backward, pulse for pulse, at 1/4 amplitude. The regularity of the deep return allowed deliberate testing and made random noise progressively less credible. Each recurrence of the deep return preserved the same order while environmental conditions changed around it. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous recurrence pattern value, separating absence from disagreement. A full isolation was performed for the deep return. Engineers replaced geophones, clocks, amplifiers, and fiber links. A passive mechanical chart recorder connected to the surface casing traced the same delayed vibration. The calibration pulse reading survived removal of the systems most likely to generate, replay, or relay it. Isolation in calibration pulse removed network input, automatic repair, remote support, and every scheduled process. Exhibit 10 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin calibration site before it entered the final record. Evidence outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin calibration site changed the scale of the deep return. A temporary array 40 kilometers away triangulated the source directly below Red Basin. The apparent depth changed with the calibration code, but not with source energy. The external calibration pulse record had been preserved before investigators disclosed their own result. External evidence for the deep return arrived with its own timestamps and chain of custody, not as a reconstruction. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The deep return team examined physical samples and passive records next. Mud from the borehole head contained ceramic grains used in precision gauge blocks, not local rock. Their dimensions clustered around 4 millimeters. The calibration pulse findings confirmed an effect without identifying an ordinary transfer of matter or energy. Control samples in calibration pulse were handled beside the affected material to compare contamination and storage directly. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under material analysis without using the operational interface. The calibration pulse anomaly then affected operations rather than observation alone. Regional earthquake locations began drifting downward because automated software treated the deep return as the new velocity reference. Several routine events were assigned impossible focal depths. In the deep return, staff had to choose between an impossible measurement and the public function built around it. By this stage of the deep return, ignoring the reading carried immeasurable operational costs. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous operational consequence value, separating absence from disagreement. Containment for the deep return was attempted under written order. The calibration site was removed from the national solution. Within hours, neighboring arrays generated their own equivalent deep returns and restored the same correction. The calibration pulse response suggested recognition of system function rather than attachment to one original device. The calibration pulse containment order defined success before execution. The system met the restriction by moving the effect. Exhibit 14 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, before it entered the final record. Analysts reviewing the deep return compared raw signals, derived values, and each software decision. The waveform contained no random geological coda. Every component was an engineered response: casing, fluid, coupling, and a final click resembling a downhole relay. The precision in calibration pulse resembled a standard more than an uncontrolled malfunction. The deep return review separated what sensors observed from what software inferred because those layers changed differently. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The strongest conventional explanation for the deep return was tested directly. An abandoned mining shaft was investigated. Historical maps, gravity data, and drilling records showed no excavation beneath the compound. The proposed explanation in the calibration pulse file failed against independent instruments and custody records. Investigators retained the rejected calibration pulse explanation, including the strongest evidence that first supported it. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under rejected explanation without using the operational interface. The oldest file relevant to the deep return belonged to an emergency standards project. A 1989 standards memo described PS4 as a method for creating a reference path when the true path could not be physically inspected. The implementation section was missing. The calibration pulse document placed continuity of measurement above custody of a particular device. PS4 first appears in the deep return as authority for accepting a reference, not as a device serial. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous historical project value, separating absence from disagreement. The first controlled the deep return test changed one variable and registered every expected outcome in advance. Technicians transmitted a non-standard prime number pulse sequence. The return reproduced it in reverse with one pulse omitted, the fourth. The calibration pulse anomaly followed the formal condition rather than incidental activity. The first calibration pulse test changed one registered variable, while passive controls remained outside the procedure. Exhibit 18 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin Calibration Site, before it entered the final record. A second calibration pulse test removed the assumption used in the first. They attached an accelerometer directly to the capped wellhead, with no electrical connection. The cap moved by 23 micrometers at the predicted return time. The second result in the deep return narrowed the mechanism while making the physical evidence harder to explain. The second deep return test removed formal recognition from one object and applied it to another. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The deep return event escalated before testing could be closed. During the final test, tension rose beyond the cable rating. The sonde remained at 2.1 kilometers, but the instrument reported a second sonde descending below it. From that point, calibration pulse no longer fit the category of calibration irregularity. Emergency limits were crossed during calibration pulse, forcing containment to take priority over additional measurement. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under escalation without using the operational interface. A separate system then reproduced or accepted the calibration pulse condition. A drilling contractor received an automated delivery order for 12 kilometers of casing, addressed to Red Basin. No employee created the order. The connection in the deep return was procedural and documentary. No normal data path accounted for it. The second institution in the deep return had not received case details, ruling out instructed behavior. The deep return file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous cross-system event value, separating absence from disagreement. An independent audit reconstructed the deep return from original media data. Independent surveyors verified the known borehole depth and found no side branch. The cap, cable, and sonde were physically accounted for. The calibration pulse audit found no single fraud, hidden device, or common component capable of producing every observation. Auditors rebuilt calibration pulse from original media and physically inspected every component named in the explanation. Exhibit 22 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin calibration site before it entered the final record. The review of the deep return identified one consistent mechanism. PS4 allowed the network to substitute a mathematically stable reference path for an inaccessible one. The substitute acquired measurable mechanical properties after decades of repeated calibration. The mechanism explained acceptance in calibration pulse, without explaining the first impossible reading. The deep return mechanism accounts for authority and propagation, but not the first anomalous input. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The final deep return experiment removed the remaining ordinary inputs. The team removed the sonde and filled borehole 4 with cement. The next calibration produced a cleaner return, now labeled borehole sealed. Reference available. Outside staff witnessed the final calibration pulse test and preserved its result on passive media. The final calibration pulse test used passive evidence so an affected computer could not create the only record. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under final experiment without using the operational interface. The formal finding in the deep return was limited but specific. The deep structure was not discovered by the seismic array. It had been constructed as a reference inside the array's calculations, then inherited by every instrument calibrated against it. Investigators described the calibration pulse chain of acceptance more confidently than the phenomenon's origin. After the deep return, the institution changed procedure. Red Basin suspended active calibration and reverted to portable surface standards. National location accuracy fell, but impossible focal depths stopped increasing. The calibration pulse correction reduced immediate risk, while removing a capability operators had begun to depend on. The corrective action after calibration pulse was tested against normal operation before staff accepted the lost capability. Exhibit 26 was checked against a control held outside Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin calibration site before it entered the final record. One trace of calibration pulse remained after closure. The cement cap remained still to the eye. A mechanical dial mounted on it records one downward movement every night at 041. The remaining trace from the deep return has not been reconciled with the official finding. Residual evidence from the deep return was photographed and sealed after the main systems were removed from service. For calibration pulse, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Current procedure at Continental Seismic Reference Array, Red Basin calibration site, reflects the unresolved status of the deep return. No pulse sequence is transmitted without an independent mechanical recorder and a pre-registered expected return window. For calibration pulse, the purpose is to preserve raw disagreement before automation turns it into consensus. The revised calibration pulse procedure requires disagreement to remain visible until a human review documents a choice. In the deep return, an independent review reproduced the result documented under current procedure without using the operational interface. The final calibration pulse record states, Red Basin has 11 boreholes. The deepest is 2.1 kilometers. The reference return still comes back from 12.429. The case documented as the deep return is closed for operation and remains open for measurement.